There are stories so old and disturbing that, even immersed in the depths of time, they continue to echo throughout eternity. Among them, one in particular stands out as a brutal and incomprehensible crime, something that shakes the foundations of human morality. The narrative of the woman, divided into 12 parts, transports us to a period of chaos and disorder, where the line between justice and cruelty seemed to blur. Imagine a time when laws were fragile, where each tribe did what seemed right in its own eyes, without a leader to guide. In this context, this terrifying story emerges, which still raises doubts, fears, and reflections today. The details are both terrifying and fascinating. A woman whose name has been lost to history is the victim of violence so extreme that she becomes a symbol of something greater. But what led to this macabre outcome? What was going on in the minds of those around her? And, even more so, how does this story reflect on the concerns of a society in collapse? The people of Israel, divided into tribes, faced increasing anarchy, and this episode seems to encapsulate all the pain and confusion of that time. It's as if every piece of his body represents a part of the torn nation. Understanding this crime is not just remembering what happened, but diving into an ocean of meanings. The Bible, in recording this story, gives us much more than a simple narrative of violence. There is, behind this act, something that touches the human condition, its flaws, and its internal battles. And here, in this crime, we also see a powerful warning, a reflection on how far society can go when it loses its fundamental values. After all, how do you get to the point of dividing a life into fragments? How did this woman become a symbol of a disintegrated nation? As we progress through this story, we will delve into the details and curiosities of the story, exploring the elements that make it not just an account of violence, but a metaphor for the fragility of justice and morality. And with each revelation, we will see how this ancient crime continues to reverberate today, challenging us to rethink the role of justice and human dignity. The time of the judges was an era of confusion and disorder. Without a king to guide, each tribe in Israel lived as they saw fit, and the concept of justice became subjective. Imagine a world where there was no consensus about right and wrong, where people depended on their own interpretations of morality. It was a time of violence and constant tension, where alliances were fragile, and human life often did not have the value it should have. In this chaos, stories like that of the divided woman emerge, which is just a reflection of the greater disorder. The people of Israel at that time were far from the unity that would be expected from an elected nation. There were judges who tried to maintain order, but their power was limited, often focused on local issues. There was no king, no central ruler to unite the tribes and enforce justice. And when justice fails, the weakest suffer. It was in this scenario of moral collapse that the crime against that woman unfolded, where her destiny intersected with the brutality of the time. The curiosities of history show us that, without leadership, society disintegrates. And in this chaotic scenario, the city of Gibeah became the scene of one of the most grotesque crimes recorded. The city, a blot on the map of Israel, was the perfect example of how things could go terribly wrong. Ruled by immorality, the city moved further and further away from the principles that should guide God's people. Every detail of this era contributed to Gibeah becoming the epicenter of a tragedy that would reflect on generations. The absence of a king, of strong leadership, opened space for shadows to grow, and the worst human instincts to manifest themselves. This period in Israel's history was not just a time of external conflict, but of internal struggle. Tribes that should have been united under the promise of a common land and God were instead divided by pride, hatred, and lack of direction. Without a king to maintain order, the cycle of violence and revenge grew unchecked. And at the center of this maelstrom was the unknown woman, victim not only of cruel individuals, but also of a society on the brink of moral collapse. How would other tribes react to this barbaric crime? We will see this later. She is one of the most tragic and, at the same time, most mysterious characters in the Bible. His name was never recorded, his identity was lost to the pages of history, but his fate became a symbol of a time of brutality. The unknown woman, a Levite's concubine, is more than a figure of violence. She represents all the women who silently suffered the consequences of a society without justice. The Bible tells us that she was a concubine, a social position that already carried a dose of fragility and submission. But who was she before this cruel fate? What did you think? What did you dream? Living as a woman at that time was not easy, especially in a patriarchal society. Women had little voice, and their worth was often measured by their ability to serve, marry, and bear children. The unknown woman was just one of many who lived in the shadow of men, their wills and whims. Yet there is something tragic about her story, a sense that her end was not just the result of one night's brutality, but the reflection of a lifetime of vulnerability. This crime was not an isolated event, but the climax of an existence marked by fragility and constant violence. The most disturbing thing is that when we analyze the story, we realize that she was used, discarded, and forgotten, until her body, divided into parts, became the warning cry of a nation. The unknown woman was the victim not only of cruel men, but of an entire society that considered her less than human. She wasn't just a concubine, she was a woman with a story that will never be fully told. How many more like her went through the same pain without their voices being heard? The interesting thing about the story is that this victim, who no one heard during his lifetime, ended up being a messenger in his death. When we reflect on this nameless woman, we are forced to question the value we give to forgotten lives, to the stories that time mercilessly erases. She represents the silent multitude of people who lived and died without leaving a trace, except for the brutality they suffered. His story, however, is kept alive, not by the details of his personal life, but by the impact of his death. What happened to her in Gibeah echoed throughout Israel, a country already morally crumbling. And the question that remains is this echo enough to awaken the consciousness of an entire nation? The Levite is a controversial figure in this dark narrative, a man who, at first glance, appears to be seeking justice, but whose actions suggest something much more complex. As a member of the priestly tribe, exemplary conduct and greater responsibility for justice and compassion were expected of him. However, his role in this tragedy raises many questions. Was he truly seeking justice, or was he driven by wounded pride and the need for revenge? What we do know is that in handing over his concubine to the crowd, he made a decision that would forever shape the destiny of Israel. There is a disturbing duality in this man. On the one hand, the Levite was the victim of a barbaric crime against someone close to him. On the other, he was complicit in unimaginable violence when he abandoned his concubine to the fury of the men of Gibeah. And instead of showing regret for what happened, he turned the woman's death into a symbol of his own outrage. Dividing her body into 12 parts and sending them to the tribes of Israel was an act of shock, a call to action, but also a way of manipulating the narrative, positioning herself as the main victim. He didn't ask for help. He demanded revenge. The Levite wanted justice, but what he was really looking for was something much more complex. By sending the pieces of his concubine's body, he was inflaming the people's anger, triggering a civil war. This act symbolized the moral corruption of a nation, but it was also a reflection of the character of the Levite himself. Instead of bringing unity, his actions further divided the people of Israel, turning the crime against his concubine into a spark that set the tribes ablaze. The interesting thing about the story is that by trying to punish Gibeah, he condemned Benjamin and almost caused the destruction of an entire tribe. But did the Levite really get justice? What did he gain by causing a war that devastated his own nation? These questions echo throughout the story, and as we delve deeper into this narrative, we realize that the pursuit of justice, when guided by dark feelings, can result in more chaos and destruction. What moved the Levite? Pride? Revenge? Or the desire to be remembered as the man who did not let crime go unpunished? In the end, he leaves us with a reflection. How far is it worth going in the name of justice? She was a victim even before the tragedy occurred. The position of concubine in society at that time already brought with it a burden of submission and silence. The woman, whose name has been lost to history, did not have the same protections or rights as a legal wife. He was, in a way, a secondary figure, living on the margins of a society that little valued his voices. Even so, his story takes on a tragic role, as what happened to him was the culmination of a series of abuses and neglect that culminated in one of the most brutal scenes ever recorded. She was a victim not only of her attackers, but of a system that constantly silenced her. The relationship with the Levite, described as unstable, already showed signs that something was deeply wrong. After a fight, she fled to her father's house in an attempt to get away. This gesture in itself is loaded with meaning. In that context, a concubine would hardly have the freedom to make this type of decision. But the fact that she fled suggests a deep dissatisfaction, a desire to escape an untenable situation. Unfortunately, his escape was just a prelude to the horror that was to come. Curiosities from history show how the fate of vulnerable people, like the concubine, can be sealed by decisions beyond their control. When the Levite finds her and takes her back, the concubine's fate has already been sealed. Gibeah would be the scene of his misfortune. When he was handed over to the crowd, his suffering was not just physical. It was also a portrait of a society that accepted the brutalization of its most fragile members. The woman was tortured and murdered without anyone lifting a finger to save her, not even her partner. The silence around her, both during the attack and after her death, echoes powerfully in this narrative. It's as if society, including those who were supposed to protect her, have refused to see her as a person worthy of compassion. This woman's legacy goes far beyond her brutal death. She has become a symbol, a reminder that, often, the most vulnerable victims are those who suffer most at the hands of an unjust society. The silence that surrounded her in life turns into a scream after her death, when her divided body is sent to the tribes of Israel. The message is clear. Ignoring a victim's pain can have devastating consequences. And as we continue with this story, we begin to understand that the violence committed against her was just the beginning of a much larger cycle of destruction. The decision to travel back to Gibeah seemed simple, but Israel's roads were fraught with danger, especially for those who could not count on the protection of an army or guards. The Levite, his concubine, and his servant headed toward the city, and each step seemed to bring them closer to an inevitable destination. The roads were inhospitable and security non-existent. Anyone who crossed them knew they were at the mercy of luck or the malice of those lurking in the shadows. The path to Gibeah would be, unbeknownst to them, the path to destruction. At a certain point in the journey, the Levite made a decision that would change the course of his lives. Instead of spending the night in a foreign city, he chose to go to Gibeah, trusting that the hospitality of the Israelites would be better. This seemingly innocent choice would prove fatal. By relying on cultural familiarity, he ignored the danger signs. Gibeah, a city within the borders of Israel, should have been a safe place, but the Levite did not know that this particular city hid deep corruption. The curiosity of history is that often the simplest choices can trigger the most complex tragedies. As night fell, the shadows of Gibeah began to show their claws. Upon arriving in the city, they sought shelter, but were rejected by everyone. Hospitality, so valued in that culture, was shockingly denied. A refusal that, in the context of that time, was a clear sign that something was wrong. Finally, an old man welcomed them into his home, offering what the others denied. However, the danger was not in the streets, but within the city itself. The evil that lurked in the shadows now surrounded them, and the coming tragedy was inevitable. The trip, which should have been a simple crossing, turned into a deadly trap. Every decision made along the way pushed the concubine and the Levite closer to their tragic fate. What began as a journey of reconciliation ended in one of the darkest episodes in the Bible. As we approach the next part of this story, we are reminded that danger does not always come from where we expect it. Evil was not just on the deserted roads, but in the cities where morality had been lost. Gibeah was a city that carried a heavy burden, a place where corruption had taken deep root and morality was slowly dissolving. Although he was part of the tribes of Israel, his actions betrayed the principles of faith and justice that should guide the people. The city's atmosphere was one of decadence, as if the values that once sustained it had been corrupted by selfishness and disdain for human life. What was supposed to be a community of brothers had become a den of violence and inhumanity, and it was there that the Levite and his concubine met their tragic fate. When we look closer, we realize that the corruption of Gibeah was not only manifested in the actions of its inhabitants, but also in the lack of compassion and hospitality, values so sacred in the culture of Israel. When the Levite arrived in the city, none of the residents wanted to offer shelter, a gesture that, at that time, was more than an offense. It was a sign of moral disintegration. The city that should have been a refuge for travelers turned out to be a place of danger. Gibeah was plunged into darkness that went beyond what could be seen. Gibeah's corruption manifested itself in subtle but devastating ways. When the men of the city came together that fateful night, their intentions made clear how deeply rooted the moral degradation was. They did not seek justice or respect. They were consumed by the desire for violence and domination. The story's curiosity reveals how Gibeah, a city that was supposed to represent the values of Israel, had become a reflection of what happens when justice and compassion are abandoned. The men of Gibeah were the mirror of a nation in collapse, and while the city slept, the concubine's fate unfolded in the hands of a maddened mob. Gibeah, a city that was supposed to be a sister within the tribes of Israel, became the scene of one of the most heinous crimes ever recorded. And so, we begin to understand that the corruption of a city can reflect the corruption of a nation. As we move forward, we see that what happened in Gibeah was more than a local crime. It was the beginning of a moral abyss that would swallow up the entire people of Israel. At that time, hospitality was a sacred value. When a traveler knocked on the door, he expected to be received with care and protection, especially among the people of Israel themselves. But that night, in Gibeah, the Levite and his concubine faced a very different reality. Upon entering the city, the Levite sought shelter, but was rejected by everyone he encountered. No one wanted to offer them a safe place to spend the night. The city, already corrupt, had forgotten its own traditions. This refusal, although silent, echoed an indifference that foreshadowed the horror to come. It was then that a kind old man, himself a stranger in Gibeah, offered them shelter in his home. He represented the last spark of humanity in a city overrun by darkness. With words of concern, the old man insisted that they not stay on the streets, as he knew the danger that lurked. But the danger was not far away. He was already hanging around the house. Little did they know that that night, the doors they were supposed to protect would become powerless in the face of the violence that was to come. Curiosities from history show us that sometimes even hospitality can be the last frontier before chaos. The tension in the house was palpable. Despite the offer of shelter, the danger approached quickly. The men of Gibeah, a violent mob with no moral limits, knocked on the door with cruel demands. They were not there out of curiosity, but driven by the desire to humiliate and destroy. The violence they carried within them recognized no barriers. The old man, in a desperate act, tried to negotiate, to offer something, anything, to avoid the misfortune that was about to happen. But that night, there was no negotiation possible. Evil had already decided its course. The request for hospitality, which should have been a gesture of humanity, turned into a prelude to tragedy. What happened next would shake Israel to its foundations. The house, which was supposed to be a place of refuge, would become a prison for the concubine, victim of unprecedented violence. And so, the night of horror began. As we progress through this story, we realize that the denied hospitality was just the first sign that, in Gibeah, justice was already dead. The night brought out the worst of human instincts. The men of Gibeah, united in a fierce mob, gathered outside the house where the Levite and his concubine were seeking shelter. They had no individual faces. They were like a collective force of destruction, driven by a perversity that seemed rooted in the bowels of the city. They knocked violently on the door, demanding something unmentionable. They wanted the Levite. They wanted to degrade, dominate, and humiliate. This was the state Gibeah found himself in, a place where honor and dignity no longer existed. It was a monstrous request, but to them, it seemed like just another night. That mob was not alone in its wickedness. The social and cultural context had allowed such behaviors to become common. The violence, often silent, had been tolerated for so long that it now surged like an uncontrollable wave. The Levite, the old man, and even the concubine all knew what the men of Gibeah were capable of doing. The city, which was supposed to protect travelers, now devoured them. The curiosity of history shows us that, when a society accepts injustice, violence becomes part of its daily life. The scene was unbearable. The Levite, in a desperate gesture, handed his concubine over to the mob. The choice to sacrifice her life in exchange for her own safety is something that deeply shocks us to this day. He knew what would happen to her, but he still made this decision. And the men of Gibeah, without hesitation, dragged her out. The terror she faced at the hands of that mob is hard to imagine. Violence so brutal that it would forever transform Israel's perception of itself. The mob didn't just seek to satisfy their desires, they sought to destroy. The men of Gibeah were not mere individuals acting in a night of fury. They represented the darkest face of a society that had lost its way. The violence committed against the concubine was not just an attack against a woman. It was an attack against humanity, against the very values that Israel was supposed to defend. And as the night unfolded, it became clear that this tragedy would be more than an isolated event. It would be the trigger for something much bigger and more devastating. But how far would this violence echo? At that decisive moment, the Levite made a decision that would forever echo in the history of Israel. By handing over his concubine to the crowd, he did the unthinkable. The door opened, and with it, the last barrier between the duty to protect and the cruel reality of a brutal sacrifice fell apart. She was pushed outside, left at the mercy of merciless men. The Levite, who was supposed to be the protector, the spiritual guide, decided to exchange her life for his own safety. That gesture of abandonment was not just an act of cowardice, but a reflection of a society in ruins, where the value of a life could be negotiated for survival. What followed was a night of unimaginable terror. The concubine, left in the hands of the violent mob, was subjected to unspeakable brutality. Every muffled scream in the darkness was a reminder of how far this city had fallen, how deeply sin had eaten away at its inhabitants. There was no compassion, there was no mercy. The concubine's sacrifice did not bring peace, nor did it save lives. it only deepened Israel's moral wound. This was the true tragedy. A life was destroyed in a senseless act of violence, and it would scar Israel forever. There is something disturbing about how the story unfolds. The Levite, even though he knew the fate that awaited his concubine, acted as if he had no choice. The decision was made coldly, without remorse. He could have fought, he could have sacrificed, but he chose the easy way out. And in doing so, he sealed not only her fate, but his own. The curiosity of the story is that the Levite, in trying to preserve his own life, triggered a cycle of violence that would cost the lives of many more. The concubine's sacrifice was the trigger for a civil war, a spiral of destruction that no one could have predicted. And so, while her sacrifice became a symbol of everything that was wrong in Israel, the Levite remained inside the house, protected from the mob's clutches. But the real question that arises is, what was left of him after that act? The conscience of a man who abandoned someone so close to violent death cannot remain untouched. The Levite, when handing over his concubine, also gave up a part of his soul to the darkness that hung over Gibeah. What would come next would be the judgment of an entire nation, but first, there was even more pain to be faced. The darkness of that night witnessed one of the most brutal scenes ever recorded in the pages of biblical history. The concubine, handed over to mob violence, was tortured in unimaginable ways. Every minute that passed was a new chapter of pain, where human dignity was completely destroyed. The screams muffled by the cold night echoed through the city, but no one came to their aid. The brutality knew no bounds, and the crowd that surrounded her seemed moved by a wild, almost primal impulse. Gibeah had become the scene of a tragedy that reflected Israel's declining moral state. The concubine's agony was not only physical, but also psychological. She was not just the victim of a crime, but of a society that had already abandoned any trace of compassion. Every blow she suffered was a reflection of the collapse of a nation that should have been guided by justice. The curiosity of the story is that this night of terror was not only the height of human evil, but the starting point for a conflict that would shake Israel from north to south. What began as the violation of one person ended as the condemnation of an entire nation. Death finally came, but not as a release, but as an inevitable end to a prolonged torment. When morning came, the concubine was found at the door of the house where she should have been protected, lying lifeless on the floor. His hand, stretched out toward the entrance, was a tragic symbol of his final attempt to seek help. To reach the protection he was denied. But at that moment, it was already too late. Gibeah had committed the crime that would seal the fate of Israel, and the concubine's death would become the trigger for revenge on a national scale. Now the Levite found himself facing the inert body of his concubine, a bitter reflection of his own failure. He handed her over, sacrificed her, and now, here she was, a mute testimony to his cowardice. But this tragedy was not over yet. Her fate, although sealed, would still wreak havoc throughout Israelite territory. The concubine's death would not soon be forgotten. Gibeah's trial was about to begin, and justice, so violated that night, would seek a new balance, albeit at a terrible price. At dawn, daylight revealed the terrible scene. The concubine, stretched out on the floor, lay motionless at the door of the house where she should have found refuge. His hand, still stretched toward the entrance, was a tragic symbol of his desperate attempt to return to a place that, ironically, offered him no protection. When the Levite opened the door and came across the body, his reaction was, to say the least, shocking. He looked at the fallen concubine, dead after a night of unspeakable torture, and his words were cold, devoid of any trace of emotion. "Get up! Come on!" he said, as if he hadn't just lost someone. This indifference is one of the most disturbing elements of this story. The Levite, instead of despairing, instead of regretting what happened, simply tried to move on. The coldness with which he treated his concubine's death is a reflection of the dehumanization that prevailed at that time. The value of life seemed to have completely vanished. The curiosity of the story lies precisely in this lack of reaction. The Levite didn't cry, he didn't scream in horror. Instead, he arranged the concubine's body, placed it on the animal and left, as if carrying some burden. This moment makes us deeply question what was going on in the Levite's mind. Would he have shut down emotionally after handing his wife over to the mob? Or was he so consumed by a desire for revenge that he could no longer feel anything? His lack of empathy, his inability to express pain or regret, shows us how corrupted the man's spirit was. The concubine's body, treated as an object, was the final symbol of the dehumanization that marked that night. And so the Levite continued on his way, carrying with him an inert body and a silent fury. But this indifference would not remain unanswered. The Levite, upon returning home, was already planning what would come next. The concubine's death would become the trigger for a much larger conflict, and he knew it. What he would do next, dismembering the body and sending its parts to the tribes of Israel, would be the final blow to an already fragmented society. The Levite's indifference in the face of death would soon turn into a flame of revenge that would turn Israel against itself. The Levite returned to his home carrying the concubine's body, and in his heart there was no more room for lamentation. What was once a personal tragedy now became a cry for revenge that would echo throughout the nation of Israel. In an act of brutality that would shock even the most hardened, he made a decision as cold as it was calculated, to dismember his concubine's body and send her parts to the 12 tribes of Israel. With each piece sent, a silent message was carried, a warning of the chaos that had ensued and a call for justice. It was a macabre vision, but it would soon inflame the spirit of the people. This brutal gesture of dismembering the body had a clear purpose: to provoke a response. The Levite knew that something so grotesque could not be ignored. He turned his concubine's death into a manifesto, a way to make all of Israel feel the weight of the injustice he himself had witnessed. But in doing so, he also turned her body into a symbol, not of mourning, but of revenge. The curiosity of the story is how the Levite manipulated the horror to mobilize a nation. The tribes that received the woman's pieces knew that something terrible had happened, and silence would not be an option. The concubine's body, divided into parts, circulated throughout Israel, carrying with it indignation and perplexity. Each tribe that received a body part knew that it was more than a call for justice. It was a call to war. The brutality of the act reflected the gravity of the situation. The Levite, by dividing the body, also divided the future of Israel. The impact of this gesture was not just in the horror it provoked, but in the way it exposed the moral collapse that was plaguing the nation. What should be sacred, human life, had been reduced to a tool of political and social manipulation. Now the stage was set for a mass response. The tribes of Israel, upon receiving the concubine's parts, knew that they could not ignore such an atrocity. But what came next would not just be a search for justice. The revenge that the Levite planted by sending the divided body would soon escalate into a much larger conflict that would shake the foundations of Israel. And so, the woman's body, which in life had been ignored, in death became the symbol of a war that was about to explode. When the concubine's body parts began to reach the tribes of Israel, the reaction was immediate and unanimous: shock and horror. Never before had they witnessed something so grotesque, so disturbing. It was a call to the conscience of a nation that was asleep in the face of the moral decadence that was spreading among them. Each tribal leader, upon receiving a piece of the body, understood that that message could not be ignored. The cruelty was not just in the crime itself, but in the way the tragedy was transformed into a symbol of revenge. Israel was forced to confront its own sins. The collective shock came not just from the brutality of the act, but from the recognition that something was deeply wrong in their midst. Gibeah, a city that was part of Israel, had committed a crime that rivaled the worst foreign enemies. The indignation that gripped the tribes was a reflection of their shame. How had it been possible to get to this point? How could an Israelite tribe have fallen so low? The curiosity of the story reveals that this indignation was not just for justice, but for a deep feeling of internal betrayal. They weren't just dealing with barbaric crime. They were dealing with moral rot within their own borders. Soon, the tribes began to mobilize, united in shared horror. The concubine's body, divided between them, now symbolized the need for unity against injustice. But Israel's response would be much more than simple justice. There was a growing fury, a sense that the nation's honor was at stake. Gibeah could not get away with it, and Benjamin, the tribe to which the city belonged, would soon find itself in the eye of a storm. The union of the tribes was driven by the need to correct the error, but also by the revenge that began to boil in their hearts. Israel's response to the Levites' message was swift and decisive. The tribes agreed that Gibeah should be held accountable, and that meant preparing for war. The initial shock would soon turn into action, and the revenge, which had begun with the death of a concubine, would spread like wildfire across the nation. But the question that remained in the air was, how far would this revenge take them? The search for justice would quickly turn into a bloody conflict, and the price to be paid would be much higher than anyone could imagine. The tribes of Israel gathered at Mizpah, a place of great spiritual significance, where the nation's most serious issues were discussed and decided. This time, however, the urgency was different. There was a feeling of revolt, an open wound that needed to be treated. Each tribe sent its representatives, and everyone was aware of the gravity of the moment. Gibeah's crime could not be ignored, and the concubine's divided body was present in everyone's mind. It was a call to justice, but also to action. Israel needed to give a clear response to show that such barbarity would not be tolerated in its midst. The atmosphere in Mizpah was one of tension and determination. The Levite, who had already initiated the summons by sending the body parts, now appeared before the tribes to report, in detail, what had happened. He did not omit the brutality, he did not sugarcoat the events. His report was shocking, and the leader's indignation only grew with each word. The curiosities of the story reveal that, at that moment, the Levite was not just telling his version of the facts. He was guiding the nation toward revenge. His words inflamed the hearts of those present, leading them to see Gibeah, and, by extension, Benjamin, as enemies to be fought. The decision to act was practically unanimous. The tribes could not allow such a horrific crime to go by without consequences. Gibeah should be punished, and, if necessary, so should the tribe of Benjamin. But, before taking any action, Israel sent a message to the Benjamites, asking them to hand over those responsible. It was a last gesture of diplomacy, an attempt to resolve the conflict without bloodshed. However, the leaders already knew that Benjamin was unlikely to accept. War seemed inevitable, but there was still a small hope that justice could prevail without the need for more violence. The assembly at Mizpah had made its decision. If Benjamin did not hand over the men of Gibeah, then war would be declared. And so, the quest for justice, which began with the death of a concubine, now turned into a national crisis. What Israel did not know, however, was how devastating this war would be. The call for justice would quickly become a spiral of revenge and destruction, the consequences of which would be felt for generations. But at that moment in Mizpah, all that mattered was Gibeah's punishment. The real question that arose was, would Benjamin choose justice or war? Benjamin, one of Israel's proudest tribes, found itself at the center of a crisis that would shake the nation. When the other tribes demanded that Gibeah hand over those responsible for the crime, Benjamin refused. Tribal pride spoke louder than justice. For them, handing over their men would mean unprecedented humiliation, a demonstration of weakness in front of the other tribes. Instead, they decided to protect the men of Gibeah. And with that decision, Benjamin put himself on a collision course with the rest of Israel. Benjamin's refusal was seen as an act of rebellion, and war, which until then had been a distant shadow, now seemed inevitable. Benjamin's decision was not only a political choice, but also an emotional one. The tribes of Israel were united in their indignation, but Benjamin felt that he was being attacked, not because of justice, but because of envy and resentment. The protection offered to the men of Gibeah was not just an act of loyalty, but a way of resisting what they considered to be unfair intervention by others. The curiosity of the story is that Benjamin, when trying to defend his pride and his men, isolated himself even more from the other tribes, plunging the nation into a fratricidal conflict. Benjamin's refusal to hand over those responsible turned the search for justice into a civil war. On the one hand, Israel demanded justice for the heinous crime committed in Gibeah. On the other, Benjamin, clinging to tribal pride, prepared to defend his members. The tension was growing, and the feeling that blood would be spilled hung in the air. Benjamin's decision to go to war, rather than seek a peaceful solution, showed how deep the divisions were between the tribes of Israel. This rebellion, however, would not be without consequences, and what was to come would be one of the most brutal battles in Israel's history. The tribe of Benjamin, small in number but mighty in spirit, was ready to face all the other tribes of Israel. What should have been a quest for justice quickly turned into a clash of pride and power. And as Benjamin prepared for battle, the other tribes also mobilized, determined to take justice into their own hands. The war was about to begin, and the price of this rebellion would be paid with lives. However, the real question that arose was, who would really emerge victorious from this war? Israel as a whole, or the tribal pride that divided them? The war that no one wanted, but that everyone knew was inevitable, finally broke out. Israel, united in its search for justice, rose up against Benjamin, the tribe that isolated itself in defense of its honor. The confrontation between brothers soon turned into one of the bloodiest episodes in Israel's history. On one side, the 11 tribes, thirsty for revenge and justice, and on the other, Benjamin, small in number, but with warriors famous for their bravery. The civil war between Israel and Benjamin was not just a physical conflict, but also a battle of values, where pride and justice collided in a brutal way. The first battles were violent and surprising. Benjamin, with his skilled warriors, managed to resist and even defeat Israel on some occasions. The tribes of Israel, larger in number, did not expect such resistance. The curiosity of history shows that Benjamin, despite being at a disadvantage, fought with incomparable ferocity. Benjamin's every victory only served to further inflame Israel's fury. What should have been a swift and fair punishment was turning into a protracted war, where hatred grew every day. The battle was no longer just for justice, but for wounded pride and desire for annihilation. The conflict between Israel and Benjamin left a trail of destruction. Lives were lost, villages were destroyed, and the floor of the Promised Land was stained with the blood of their own children. This civil war showed how far Israel was willing to go to restore justice, but it also revealed the flaws of a nation that could not solve its problems without resorting to violence. Benjamin, with her strength and determination, fought not to be crushed, but the cost of this resistance would be too high. The civil war began as a search for justice, but quickly turned into a spiral of violence that no one seemed able to control. And thus, Benjamin's fate was sealed. The conflict that began with the defense of Gibeah soon turned into a battle for the tribe's very survival. The other tribes of Israel, determined not to retreat, were willing to decimate Benjamin if necessary. The civil war continued to intensify, and the question that arose was whether Israel could ever recover from such division. What would come next would not just be a final battle, but a brutal judgment of the very heart of Israel. The tribes of Israel, confident in their numerical superiority and convinced that justice was on their side, marched against Benjamin, believing victory would be swift. However, what they found on the battlefield was very different from what they expected. Benjamin, with his fierce warriors, inflicted a series of crushing defeats on the united tribes. The shock of the first defeats deeply shook Israel, which could not understand how such a small tribe could resist with such strength. Desperation began to spread, and many wondered if God had truly blessed their mission of revenge. Each defeat at the hands of Benjamin felt like an injustice to Israel. How could it be that those who sought justice, those who wished to punish those guilty of such a heinous crime, were losing? The feeling of impotence grew, and the confidence they had taken to the battlefield turned into doubt. The curiosities of history reveal that these first defeats served to test Israel's resolve, but also to expose its weaknesses. War was no longer just a question of justice, but a struggle against one's own despair and the uncertainty of divine purpose. Despair grew as Israel realized that each defeat was costing more lives, and the conflict that had begun as a search for justice now seemed to be turning into an endless nightmare. Leaders began to question whether they had misinterpreted God's will, whether the price of justice was really so high. With each battle lost, the cost of war increased, and troop morale plummeted. The Israelites were being forced to confront a harsh truth. It was not so simple to win when the enemy was their own pride and that of the Benjamites. And so, after the first defeats, Israel found itself faced with a difficult choice: continue fighting, risking more lives and facing the possibility of new defeats, or retreat and accept that the justice they sought was perhaps beyond their reach. But Israel, wounded in its honor, was not ready to give up. They would turn to battle again, this time with more determination and more thirst for revenge. The war against Benjamin was far from over, and the scars of the first defeats only served to fuel the desire to completely annihilate his rebellious brothers. After the first defeats, Israel regrouped, determined not to accept any more failures. The cry for justice had turned into a relentless desire for revenge. The tribes, driven by a mixture of despair and fury, consulted the Lord one last time before attacking Benjamin again. This time, the battle would be different. They were prepared for all-out war, and Benjamin, despite his bravery, could no longer resist the overwhelming strength of the other united tribes. Benjamin's fate was sealed, and what followed was relentless destruction. The final battle was brutal. Benjamin, despite his courage and skill, no longer had the strength to continue resisting. Their warriors, who had previously humiliated Israel, were now being crushed. The siege was closing, and there was no escape. The curiosity of the story is that Israel's determination was no longer just for initial justice, but for a need to erase the affront that Benjamin had represented. The small tribe, which had refused to hand over the culprits of Gibeah, now faced total annihilation. The pride that led them to war now became their undoing. When the dust from the last battle settled, Benjamin was practically destroyed. Of a once proud and strong tribe, only scattered survivors remained. The other victorious tribes of Israel looked at the battlefield strewn with dead and felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Had justice been done, or was the price paid too high? Israel's victory was won at the cost of thousands of lives, and the sense of triumph soon turned to regret. The story's curiosity shows that sometimes the pursuit of justice can destroy more than just the enemy. Israel's victory marked Benjamin's downfall, but the nation as a whole was wounded. The tribes of Israel, who should have been united by a common purpose, were now divided by guilt and pain. What began as a call for justice ended as a national tragedy, and as the few surviving Benjamites hid, the people of Israel began to question the true cost of the war. Was the destruction of an entire tribe the price they were willing to pay for justice? The war was over, but the scars would remain forever. With the end of the war, Israel found itself facing a devastating reality. Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, was on the verge of extinction. The pride that had driven them to battle had destroyed them, and now there were only a few survivors left, scattered and hidden. Israel, which had fought so fiercely to punish injustice, now faced a new dilemma. Could an entire tribe disappear from God's people? Benjamin's destruction was not only a bitter victory, but a deep wound in the unity of Israel. It was an issue that touched the very identity of the nation. Repentance began to emerge among the tribes. Victory had been won, but at what cost? Israel's leaders, who had once cried out for justice, now wondered if they had gone too far. The curiosity of history is that even after such a bloody war, the desire to preserve Israel's integrity prevailed. Benjamin, although reduced to almost nothing, was still a part of Israel, and allowing its extinction would be an irreversible blow. The tribes began searching for a way to save what was left of Benjamin, ensuring that the tribe's name and lineage would not disappear from history. The dilemma was complex. How could they save Benjamin without betraying the principles of justice for which they fought? The tribes of Israel had sworn that they would not give their daughters in marriage to Benjamin's survivors, but now they faced a difficult choice. If Benjamin was not given wives, the tribe would die with the last remaining men. The decision to save Benjamin was made, but with it came a new act of violence: the kidnapping of women from Jabesh Gilead to ensure the tribe's survival. Once again, the solution to a problem generated new scars, and violence continued to be the answer in a wounded nation. And so, Benjamin, a nearly extinct tribe, was saved, but in a controversial manner. Benjamin's survival came not through reconciliation or peace, but through a new injustice. Israel, although united in its decision to preserve the tribe, now bore the weight of yet another violent act. The curiosity of history shows that even in moments of repentance, Israel's solutions often perpetuated the cycle of pain and violence. Benjamin would survive, but the nation as a whole would be forever scarred by this fratricidal war. Faced with the near extinction of the tribe of Benjamin, the tribes of Israel faced a profound moral dilemma. The war, which was supposed to bring justice, almost erased one of the 12 tribes from the map of Israel. However, the promise not to give his daughters in marriage to the Benjamites complicated any attempt to preserve them. It was then that a controversial solution emerged, a decision that, although it guaranteed Benjamin's survival, also perpetuated the cycle of violence. Israel's eyes turned to Jabesh Gilead, a city that had not participated in the war, and it was decided that the women of that city would be taken by force to become wives of the surviving Benjamites. This plan, however pragmatic it was far from fair. Jabesh Gilead, which had remained on the sidelines of the conflict, now paid a very high price for its neutrality. The city's women, with no choice, were kidnapped and handed over to Benjamin as a way of ensuring the continuity of the tribe. The curiosity of history reveals that, in an attempt to correct one mistake, Israel committed another. The kidnapping of the women of Jabesh Gilead was a desperate solution to a situation that seemed to have no way out, but it generated even more suffering and disorder. The violence that Israel inflicted on Jabesh Gilead reflects the moral complexity of the time. What began as a search for justice had turned into a chain of difficult decisions, where solutions were always accompanied by new acts of violence. The women of Jabesh Gilead, torn from their families, were forced to marry the Benjamites, and so the tribe of Benjamin began to rebuild. However, the cost of this reconstruction was extremely high, and the nation of Israel, as a whole, found itself increasingly entangled in a cycle of pain. The controversial solution did not bring the peace Israel expected. The wounds opened by the war and subsequent decisions continued to mark the heart of the nation. Benjamin had been saved from extinction, but the price paid for the tribe's survival was a new injustice that hung over Israel. The women of Jabesh Gilead, who became wives by force, represented yet another layer of suffering in a story already filled with tragedy. And so, the nation asked itself, how long would this spiral of violence continue? What began as an act of revenge now left a legacy of pain and regret. The story of Gibeah is not just a narrative of violence and revenge, it is also a powerful lesson about the dangers of a society that abandons justice and compassion. The crime committed at Gibeah, followed by the decisions that led to civil war and Benjamin's near extinction, reveals something much deeper about human nature and the moral collapse that can happen when pride and revenge take the place of justice. The lesson of Gibeah is clear. A nation that turns a blind eye to the injustice in its midst is doomed to fall into a cycle of destruction. History shows that when society fails to protect the most vulnerable, as happened with the concubine, it paves the way for corruption and violence. The tribes of Israel, by ignoring the signs of moral decay in Gibeah, allowed cruelty to take root. The curiosity of the story reveals that the lesson of Gibeah is not just for that time, but echoes today. It reminds us that injustice, when left unaddressed, can grow and corrupt the entire social fabric. What began as a crime in one city became a national tragedy. The deep meaning of Gibeah lies in the way justice was perverted, both by the men who committed the crime and by the tribes who sought revenge. The act of dismembering the concubine's body and sending her parts to the tribes was a call to action, but also a reflection of a society that had lost its sense of dignity and compassion. Violence was used to respond to violence, and the result was devastating. What should have been a quest for justice turned into an endless cycle of pain and destruction. The lesson of Gibeah is an eternal warning. True justice cannot be achieved through revenge, and the price of ignoring moral principles is always high. What happened in Gibeah was a symptom of a nation that was moving away from the values that should guide it. Israel, by seeking to punish injustice with more violence, ended up destroying itself. And so the story of Gibeah reminds us that without compassion and a true sense of justice, a society can quickly fall into the abyss of moral destruction. The concubine's body, cruelly divided into 12 parts and sent to the tribes of Israel, became a powerful and disturbing symbol. That woman, whose name has been lost to history, represented not just a victim of violence, but the very condition of Israel at that time. Every piece of his body carried a message of disintegration, not only physical, but also moral and spiritual. Israel as a nation was fragmented, divided into tribes that could no longer find unity. The symbolism of the divided woman reflected a people who had lost their way, whose parts no longer formed a cohesive whole. Each tribe that received a body part was forced to confront the reality of their own guilt. The curiosity of the story is that Gibeah's crime was a mirror of what was happening in Israel as a whole. The lack of justice, disunity, and departure from divine values were present in every corner of the country. The concubine's divided body represented the internal division of Israel, which no longer knew how to protect its own, how to guarantee justice, or how to maintain peace among its members. What should have been a people united under the covenant with God was tearing itself apart from within. The woman's fragmented body was also a call to reflection. Israel needed to face the bitter truth that its internal disintegration had allowed crimes like Gibeah to happen. Justice was no longer a central value, and compassion was lost. what began as a simple act of sending dead body parts turned into a living metaphor for the fragmentation of a nation. Each tribe, upon receiving a piece, felt the weight of responsibility and guilt. The concubine's body was not just a plea for justice, but a warning about the state of a society in decline. The divided woman was divided Israel. Its physical fragmentation was a portrait of the spiritual and moral disunity of a nation that should be an example of justice and compassion. And so, the story of his death became a symbol of something much greater: the need for restoration, reconciliation, and a return to the principles that once united the tribes. The question that hung over Israel, and that resonates to this day, was how to rebuild something that was so deeply torn apart. The tragedy of Gibeah was not an isolated event, but the reflection of a cycle of violence that would continue to echo throughout Israel's history. What began as a brutal crime turned into a civil war, and the effects of this spiral of destruction would be felt for generations. The nation, which should be an example of justice and compassion, found itself trapped in a pattern of retaliation where revenge took precedence over justice, and violence became the automatic response to any offense. The story of Gibeah is a warning about how the cycle of violence can perpetuate itself, feeding on the very hatred it generates. Israel, like so many other nations throughout history, would repeat this cycle at different times. Whenever justice was set aside and revenge took its place, the result was the same: destruction and division. The echo of Gibeah can be seen in the internal battles, the betrayals between tribes, and the conflicts that followed over the years. The curiosity of the story reveals that Gibeah was not the only episode where unbridled violence destroyed what should have been a search for justice. The lesson that Israel did not learn at Gibeah was that violence only begets more violence, and this truth resonates through the centuries. Every time Israel chose the sword instead of reconciliation, it repeated Gibeah's mistake. The tribes, over the years, faced numerous conflicts that could have been avoided if the lesson of Gibeah had been taken seriously. Benjamin's near-complete destruction was an extreme example of what happens when justice is replaced by fury. The echo of Gibeah reverberated in the decisions of future leaders, in wars against other nations, and even in the internal divisions that would fragment the kingdom of Israel. The cycle of violence once started seemed impossible to break. The cycle of violence that began in Gibeah is also reflected in many stories from our own time. Humanity, over the centuries, has continued to fall into the same trap, responding to violence with more violence. The story of Gibeah is a reminder that without true justice, without compassion, and without the will to break the cycle, violence will continue to rage, destroying not only its enemies, but also the nation itself. And so, the story of Gibeah, although ancient, continues to have painful relevance today. The story of the concubine of Gibeah is just one of many examples of how women's voices in the biblical narrative were often silenced. She has no name, no story beyond what was imposed on her by the violence she suffered. Her voice, like that of so many other women, was erased by the brutality of a patriarchal society, where their lives were often considered to be of lesser value. And her fate was not unique. The Bible, in its depth, contains countless stories of women who were victims of a reality where power and authority were in the hands of men. These women, whose lives were marked by oppression, rarely had the opportunity to express their pain and fears. The interesting thing about the story is that, even in a sacred text that values justice and compassion, many of these female voices remained silent. Gibeah's concubine was sacrificed, not only because of the physical violence she suffered, but also because of the silence that surrounded her. The absence of her perspective in the narrative is a reflection of how women, throughout history, have been made invisible, their stories told through the actions and decisions of others. The fate of women in the Bible is, in many cases, one of silent survival. They were mothers, wives, daughters, but often seen only as accessories in men's stories. Gibeah's concubine is an extreme example of this fate, but she is not the only one. Women like Tamar, Bathsheba, and even Esther, although they played important roles, also faced a culture that marginalized them. Their voices were, to a large extent, shaped by the circumstances imposed by a society that did not allow them to be protagonists of their own stories. The story of Gibeah's concubine leads us to reflect on the many female voices that are still silenced today. Her tragedy echoes other stories, both ancient and modern, of women who continue to fight for recognition, dignity, and their rights. And so, by remembering the silent voices of the Bible, we are called to reevaluate how justice can be served for those whose stories have not been fully told. After all, what would have happened in the history of Israel if the voices of women, like that of the concubine, had been heard? One of the most disturbing issues in the story of Gibeah is divine silence in the face of such brutality. The Bible frequently shows God intervening in times of crisis, bringing justice and redemption to His people. However, in the story of the concubine of Gibeah, God seems absent. The horror that unfolded that night occurred without a word of comfort or divine intervention. God's silence raises a profound theological question. Why did He allow such an atrocity to happen without intervening? This silence echoes in the minds of many who read this story and seek to understand the purpose behind the apparent absence of heavenly justice. Perhaps, in the silence, God was allowing Israel to confront its own moral and social failings. The curiosity of the story is that in several biblical passages, God's silence is a way of allowing human beings to see the consequences of their own choices. The people of Israel, who should have been an example of justice and compassion, allowed corruption and violence to flourish within their own tribes. The divine silence at Gibeah, then, can be seen as a kind of silent judgment, where God allowed Israel to see how far they had strayed from His principles. The theology of divine silence also invites us to reflect on human suffering. There are times when God apparently does not intervene immediately, allowing evil to take its course. The story of the concubine makes us ask, where was God when the injustice happened? But this same story also challenges us to look at our own societies and question where we are allowing injustice to occur without doing anything. Perhaps the divine silence in Gibeah is not so much an absence of God as a provocation for us, as human beings, to take responsibility for fighting the evil in our midst. In the end, the theological reflection on divine silence in Gibeah reminds us that divine justice is not always immediate. Sometimes God allows humanity to become lost in its own darkness, so that, in the end, we understand the depth of our need for redemption. The silence at Gibeah may have been disturbing, but it was also a way of teaching Israel that justice cannot be delegated to others. It must be actively sought by those who wish to live in a morally upright society. And as we progress through history, we understand that God's silence would not last forever. The story of the concubine of Gibeah may seem distant and brutal, but its lessons continue to resonate in our modern society. It forces us to confront the issue of injustice and violence that, in different forms, still plagues the world. The dehumanization that occurred back then is not so different from what we see in conflicts, oppression, and abuse that occur today. The relevance of this story is that it reminds us of the danger of allowing moral corruption and selfishness to infiltrate our communities, leading to the suffering of the most vulnerable. What happened in Gibeah is a warning that when justice is ignored, chaos takes its place. Today, as then, we still deal with the consequences of societies that often turn their backs on oppressed voices. Gibeah's concubine, whose name is lost to history, may represent the millions of people who are victims of violence and injustice every day. The curiosity of history lies in how such an ancient event continues to reflect the same struggles we face today. From domestic violence to social injustices, this story reminds us that the search for justice and dignity can never be abandoned. The current relevance of this story also lies in the way it makes us reflect on the power of revenge. The cycle of violence that began with a barbaric crime soon spread, consuming an entire nation. The lesson is clear. Justice cannot be built on the foundation of revenge, for it destroys both the perpetrator and those who seek retribution. In our day, where conflicts arise from all sides, this story challenges us to find paths to justice that do not perpetuate the cycle of destruction, but that bring true reconciliation and peace. As we confront the story of Gibeah, we are called to not only remember what happened in the past, but to act in the present. What injustices do we still tolerate? What voices are we ignoring? The story of the divided concubine is a warning and, at the same time, an invitation to seek a future where justice prevails and where human dignity is respected above all. The question that remains is, are we willing to learn from the past, or will we continue to repeat its mistakes? Gibeah's legacy is dark, a history marked by violence, injustice, and pain. But amid this darkness, there is also a powerful lesson about the need for redemption. The brutal crime that occurred that night was not just an isolated event, but a reflection of a nation that has strayed from the values that should guide it. The outcome of this story, with the near extinction of Benjamin's tribe, shows us how pride and revenge can destroy everything around them. Yet, throughout this narrative of destruction, there remains a glimmer of hope, the possibility of redemption, even after the worst of moral collapses. Israel, upon recognizing its mistakes, sought to restore what had been broken. Benjamin's survival, although controversial, symbolizes a nation's ability to rise again after chaos. The curiosity of the story is that, even in the darkest moments, the Bible shows us that there is room for reconciliation. Although Gibeah represents the fall of Israel in moral terms, the effort to preserve unity among the tribes, even after so much violence, is a testimony that redemption is always possible. The cycle of violence can be interrupted as long as there is repentance and a sincere search for justice. Gibeah's legacy also serves as a constant reminder that justice must be pursued with integrity. What began as an attempt to punish a crime ended up turning into a fratricidal war, and this should warn us about the dangers of allowing revenge to take control. Still, the hope of redemption is present. Israel, although it failed in many ways, continued to search for a way to restore balance and peace among the tribes. And this search for reconciliation, however imperfect, reminds us that justice and redemption go hand in hand. As we close the story of Gibeah, we are left with an important reflection. The hope of redemption is never out of reach, but it demands that we confront our mistakes and turn to true justice. What happened in Gibeah does not need to be repeated. History is there to teach us, to warn us about the dangers of violence and disunity, and, above all, to show us that, even in the midst of chaos, there is always a chance for a fresh start. Israel's future, like ours, depends on learning these lessons and forging a path where justice and redemption can prevail.
If you're interested in having a Bible like the one we use in our studies, check out the link in the first pinned comment. If you enjoy our content and can support our channel, consider buying us a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Additionally, if you can purchase a crucifix, we also have a link in the first pinned comment. We greatly appreciate your support. God bless, and see you in the next video.